All right, so chapter 17, part 4, and it's going to go over the Russian Revolution. And one of the most important consequences of World War I was the actual Russian Revolution. And the main revolution happens in 1917. So what causes it? So the roots of the revolution, uh, the Russian czars, which are emperors, czar is short for Caesar, which is emperor again, acted as autocrats, which are an absolute ruler. So a complete dictator is what they are. So they had their own secret police, the czar did. They had strict censorship, so you couldn't say anything against the czar and his government. And then all new ideas were repressed, and you'll find out why eventually. So the vast majority of Russians were illiterate serfs, so they couldn't read or write. They didn't own their own property. They remain bound to the land, so they're renting the land from the landowners, and they really never get out of that rent. They never make enough to get out of that rent, and that was how the system was set up. So long after serfdom had been completely abolished in Western Europe, it was actually still going in Russia, and most people were serfs in Russia. But you did have a small group of nobles, so a very small group, and they owned thousands of serfs. So these people that they rented land to, that they paid them every month in whatever they grew and things like that, and they enjoyed vast wealth. So you had a very small group of people that were extremely wealthy in Russia. So despite earlier efforts to introduce Western ideas, and that goes all the way back to Peter the Great, and technology. So every once in a while, they bring in these Western ideas. They bring in this technology into Russia. Social conditions kept the country economically underdeveloped. Okay, so if you got most of your population as serfs, it's not good for your country, especially economically. And then the last part. Russian reformers, inspired by the example of Western Europe, hope to abolish serfdom and to modernize their country. So you do have some people that know that you should get rid of serfdom and things like that. So the emancipation of the serfs. So in the 19th century, Russia was considered the protector of Orthodox Christians in Asia. And Russia went to war against the Ottoman Empire that were Muslims. Okay, so they're protecting these Christians from the Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. So Russia engaged in what was the Crimean War versus Turkey or versus the Ottoman Empire. And at that time, England and France actually was on the side of Turkey. So they fought against Russia. So despite its large army, Russia eventually loses the war. And after the Crimean War, Tsar Alexander II decided to listen to these reformers that we had talked about on the last page, and he emancipated or liberated the serfs in 1861, which isn't going to help them. I mean, he just said, okay, you guys are not serfs anymore, uh, but you don't give them land and things like that. It's not going to matter. So he wanted to introduce a new assembly and other reforms, so a new type of government, but he gets assassinated by Russian revolutionaries. And this put an abrupt end to all of his attempts at trying to reform Russia, which really hurts him later on. So the freed serfs remain landless peasants, and they still end up paying rent to their former owners. So later czars returned to the policy of opposing all change completely, and they would use harsh repression to maintain the existing social order. So if anybody got out of hand, they would bring the army in to stop any of the revolts or any of the uprisings. And this is the assassination of Alexander II. And this is the actual coat that he was wearing when he was killed. So autocracy, nationality, and orthodoxy, those are the three things that Russia kind of concentrates on. So Russian nationalism had important effects on its conservative rulers. So their nationalism, which they thought they were the best, and all these other things in Russian was pure, it had an effect on their rulers. So they identified the empire with autocracy, the Russian nationality, and the Orthodox Church. Those are the three most important things in Russia. So the government acted as a protector of the new Slavic states in the Balkans. That's kind of the area around Greece. And the government adopted a policy of Russification. So this forced non-Russian people, such as Finns, Poles, and other peoples of Central Asia, to adopt Russian language and culture. So they had to change everything that they were doing if they lived in Russia, learn Russian, and then they had to wear Russian clothes and things like that. So Jews were persecuted under what's called anti-Semitic pogroms, and those are when people would get together and they would actually go out and attack Jews. So this was also going on in Russia. So this was officially encouraged persecutions against the Jews by the government, actually. So prelude to revolution. So what's happening right before revolution? In the 1900s, the Russian Empire stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Huge country. Russia remains extremely backwards compared to the rest of Western Europe. Peasants and factory owners lived in conditions of terrible poverty, and then landowning nobles enjoyed lives of wealth and leisure. So you have this complete separation between the extremely wealthy and everybody else in the country being very poor. So the autocratic czars opposed democratic reform, and you had secret revolutionary societies that started to form among the members of the educated elite. Okay, so this is kind of just gives you a depiction of how people lived in Russia at that time. And these are going to be three of the main leaders, which we're going to get into. And the Russian Revolution of 1905. So what you're going to see is a bunch of series of small revolutions. So you have the Russo-Japanese War, and Russia gets defeated again. So we had the Crimean War, they get beat by Turkey. And then in this war, they get defeated by the Japanese. Again, very small army versus a very large Russian army, and they lose. So this actually worsened the crisis in Russia. So in 1905, you had what's called Bloody Sunday. And a lot of countries have a Bloody Sunday where you have this revolt and people actually get shot by their own government. So troops of the Tsar trampled, and so in other words, they ran their horses across unarmed demonstrators in St. Petersburg, causing revolutions to break out across the country. So small little revolutions all across the country in different cities. Peasants seized land. So the peasants would take the land away from the landowners, while workers in cities engaged in demonstrations and general strikes. So they just stopped working. So Tsar Nicholas II, this is the new Tsar now, finally granted limited reforms. So he actually had a legislature start, like our Congress, and that was called the Duma. And but still, these are limited reforms. So only the very wealthy could vote. So there's a small amount of people in Russia that actually got to vote. And this is a painting of the Bloody Sunday. And these are the protesters being shot by their own army. And then you had the Revolution of 1917. This is the big one. So the years after 1905 showed some signs of improvement, but Russia was not prepared what was going to happen next, which ends up being World War I. So in 1914, Nicholas II brought Russia into World War I against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Poorly trained and badly equipped Russian soldiers suffered disastrous defeats. Troops even were sent into battle without ammunition, so without bullets. And they were told to pick up weapons of their dead comrades. So the story that they say is there would be two Russians sent in, one would be killed, and the other one would have to pick up the rifle of the guy that was killed. So defeats caused even more widespread discontent in the army, and the Russian industries were incapable of producing needs of weapons and supplies. So they just couldn't make anything for war. And these are some Russian troops here. And this is our Nicholas right here talking to the troops. So this is before they're set off to battle, and this is kind of what they look like once they got there. So food supplies were also dangerously low at this time. So you have the February Revolution of 1917, and workers led food riots that broke out in cities all across Russia. So workers actually, they were starving to this, so they had these food riots, and it just goes all across Russia. And in March 1917, soldiers refused to fire on the strikers. So these factory workers wouldn't go back to work, and eventually the soldiers who had been shooting them, like we saw on Bloody Sunday, refused. And once that happened, that was it for the Tsar. So Nicholas realized that he was powerless to govern the nation if he couldn't just punish them for whatever they were doing, and he actually gave up the throne. So he what's called abdicated. So leaders of the Duma declared Russia a republic, just like the United States. So this is the Duma at the time. They declare themselves a republic. People are going to get to vote for the first time and all these other things. However, the provisional, which is the temporary government that they set up since the Tsar is not there anymore, that had replaced the Tsar, failed to win the support of the people when it refused to withdraw from the war. So its problem is the people do not want to be in World War I anymore. And this new temporary government says, no, we have to stay in, which most countries did back then because they had obligations to other countries. So you have the October Revolution of 1917. And this is where Lenin comes in. So Lenin was a follower of Karl Marx, which we had already studied. Karl Marx is the one who comes up with Marxism, communism, socialism. And he's living in exile in Switzerland. So the Germans get him and they send him back to Russia, hoping he causes a bunch of problems and in Russian and unrest in Russia and gets the Russians out of the war. So if this revolutionary can go back and get the Russians out of the war, that's one group of people that the Germans don't have to fight anymore. So this would help end the war on the Eastern Front, which is Russia versus Germany, allowing Germany to concentrate on defeating the Western Allies, which is going to be Britain and France. So the Bolsheviks, these are the Lenin supporters, and they made a real simple promise. They promised peace, so they're going to get out of the war, bread, they're going to give everybody food, and then land. Everybody's going to get peasants. So peace for the soldiers, bread for the workers, and land for the peasants. So in November 1917, the Bolsheviks seize power. So there's a vote, the Bolsheviks don't win, and they actually just take over. And Bolsheviks actually means majority, but they were never the majority. They just took over. They just walked in and took over the government. So the Bolsheviks changed the name of the political party to the Communist, and they also changed the name of the country to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which is the USSR, or for short terms, the Soviet Union. So Russia became the world's first communist country. So you have a Russian civil war, and once in power, the communists immediately withdrew from World War I, which they said they were going to do against Germany. They transferred millions of acres of land to their poor peasants, which they said they were going to do. So they gave up, they took the landowners' land away and they gave it to the peasants. They nationalized all industries. So all factories, all the major industries were all taken over by the government. And then a civil war followed with those who supported Lenin and those who wanted to bring the Tsar back. So you have this time where people were still wanting the Tsar to be in charge. So on the red side, which was most of the people, of course, these are the supporters of Lenin. And they're victorious, and they secured the position of the new communist government. So this kind of let everybody know this is the type of government that we're going to have. And they had the support of the peasants and the workers, so a majority of the people in Russia. And then the side of the whites was everybody who supported bringing the king back or the Tsar back. And they had actually support from the United States. The United States actually was trying to help the Tsar gain power back in Russia. After winning the Civil War, Lenin executed Tsar Nicholas II and his family in cold blood so that the monarchy could never be restored. So he killed the whole family so that there was no royalty in Russia that could be put back in charge, which happened a lot. If you remember what happened with Napoleon and things like that. So Lenin's new economic policy. So he's got a mess on his hands. So he's got to change everything. So after half a decade of turmoil, the Russian economy was completely in shambles. Now the Bolsheviks had gained political control. They needed to deliver on their promises to feed the people. So by 1920, Lenin realized that changes in his program were needed. So changes in communism actually were needed. So peasants were no longer growing enough food since they were afraid it was going to be seized by the government. So what would happen if farmers would grow all this food and the government would just come down and take it and give it to the soldiers? So they didn't want to grow food if it was just going to be taken from them. And then in 1921, you have a severe famine in Russia. So everything's just going against Lenin. So Lenin came to the conclusion that communist policies would have to be paused for a while. So you're not going to reach this utopian communist country right off the bat. So he had to change some of the ideas. So his new economic policy, he wanted to keep the peasants satisfied. He wanted to keep the Bolsheviks in power, and then he wanted to stabilize the economy. So the new economic policy, he allowed some private ownership. So he allowed market economy, allowed capitalism a little bit, and he permitted small scale manufacturing and agriculture that was owned by people, not by the government. So government continued to control the big industries, but like farms and things like that, small businesses could actually be owned by people, which is against the communist idea. So slowly, this increased production, but then right after that, in 1924, Lenin dies. And when Lenin dies, Joseph Stalin takes over Russia, and he ends the new economic policy. Everything is changed back to government owned.